In 2017, two Coast Guardsmen, Nate and Russell, were sent to Matinicus Rock, a jagged outcrop in the middle of the ocean where the wind howls year-round and the cold waves never cease to crash on the shore. The mission seemed simple, routine maintenance on an automated lighthouse. But Matinicus was more than just an island. It was a forgotten place, where time stood still and isolation drained the warmth from the people. There was nothing but the wind, the sea, and the flickering light that watched them through the endless night. The first days passed in a cold repetition, scraping rust from cold metal, filling smelly oil tanks, checking batteries in silence. Nothing unusual, but nothing exciting either. The evenings were quiet, just the flickering of oil lamps on old books, the slow shuffle of cards in the yellow light, and the steady roar of the wind like a distant, never-ending voice. There was something about the silence, as if the island were listening to their every breath. On the fourth night, at exactly 2 a.m., Nate awoke not to a sound, but to the utter silence. The beacon, the light that had been steadily sweeping through the night mist, had gone out. Darkness had swallowed the island. He and Russell climbed the wind-whipped, damp iron stairs to the tower. At the top they stopped. Something was stuck in the machinery that always worked perfectly, a piece of black, slimy cloth, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of a cold sea. It didn't belong to any of the devices, and it was so cold that it made both men shiver. The next night, the lighthouse went out again. Another accident, another chill. When they took apart the jammed gears, what emerged was smaller this time, a frayed red scarf, soaked with salt water and the stench of rotting seaweed. Small barnacles clung to the fabric, as if it had been lying on the ocean floor for decades. No one on the island had a red scarf. No one lived around here. And why was it so tightly sealed? Russell said nothing, but Nate knew they both sensed the same thing. Something wrong, creeping silently up from the depths. The isolation was no longer a feeling, it became the air, thick, heavy, seeping into every breath. They began to block every exit. Windows were slammed, bolted. Crates were stacked against the stairs like a fragile fortress against something invisible. Neither of them said it, but they both knew. The abnormality wasn't out there, it was here. On Saturday night, in the pitch blackness and the whispering wind, Russell leaned his head toward a corner of the inky room and whispered something. The whisper was so soft that Nate couldn't hear it, but he saw it clearly. Russell was talking to the void, to something that stood there motionless, unblinking. Russell finally spoke, in a voice as hoarse as if eaten away by the salt. He said he had seen a figure, hunched over, standing motionless on the rocks below, just at the edge of the lighthouse's last light, before it melted into the darkness, as if it had never existed. From that night on, Russell was changed. He sat for hours by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, he didn't answer. He just stared out to sea, as if afraid that if he looked away, the thing would come closer. On the 9th night, when the offshore wind was at its fiercest, heavy footsteps sounded from upstairs, slow, drawn-out steps, as if something too big to exist was coming down. Then, silence. No opening of doors, no crash, just a dead pause. Russell appeared at the foot of the stairs a few minutes later, his face as white as if drained of blood, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stammered almost inaudibly, I didn't go up there. Neither did you. But he just came down. On the 9th night, when the offshore wind was at its fiercest, heavy footsteps sounded from upstairs, slow, drawn-out steps, as if something too big to exist was coming down. Then, silence. No opening of doors, no crash, just a dead pause. Russell appeared at the foot of the stairs a few minutes later, his face as white as if drained of blood, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stammered almost inaudibly, I didn't go up there. Neither did you. But he just came down. At dawn, Nate sent out an emergency signal, short, broken, his voice shaking as if pulled from the depths. But there was a more curious record in the Coast Guard radio log at 2:12 a.m. Amid layers of static, a gasp, then a broken whisper, no, it's not him, it's them. Then the signal disappeared as if it had never existed. Russell returned to the mainland, his eyes glazed over, speechless, unresponsive as if his mind had been trapped in that tower. A few days later, he filed a letter of resignation, signing it with a shaky hand. As for Nate, from then on, whenever anyone mentioned Matinicus Rock, he fell silent, not out of fear but as if the place had called out to him and almost held him back. Matinicus Rock still stands isolated, desolate, without electricity, without water, without signal, just a shivering lighthouse in the Atlantic fog. But everyone who has set foot on it agrees on one thing. It is not entirely empty. Something, smoky, invisible, patient, waiting with each rotation of the beam when the darkness returns. It listens. And then, it comes closer. The last person to leave no longer mentions the rock's name. The question now is, when the light goes off again, who will be the fool to board the boat? Will it be you? At the height of the COVID lockdown, when cities were eerily quiet and time stretched like mottled shadows on deserted streets, a young man on Long Island was trapped in a suffocating monotony. With no family nearby, no voice other than his own, he lived in a small apartment where the ticking of the clock cut through the air like a knife. Loneliness became real, stalking him in the mirror, in the flickering light of the television, in his broken sleep at night. Desperate for someone, something to remind him he was still human, he installed Tinder, and on the other side of the screen, someone was waiting. He started chatting with someone who seemed familiar, Sophia, or as she went by her bizarre online name, Soph. He'd followed her on Instagram for a long time, but he'd never spoken to her. Her pictures had always been blurry, foggy, or purposefully distorted. She lived just a 5-minute drive away, and like him, she said she was tired of being cooped up in her own four walls. But when he asked her what neighborhood she lived in, the answer came slowly, very slowly, almost typed out, as if someone were imitating the way humans spoke. Still, something tugged at him, a vague memory that he'd seen that face, not just on Instagram, but somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't name. And when she said, "You still remember me, right?" his hand went cold, because he'd never texted her, and Sophia had been dead for 2 years. They met. No dinner, no movies, just a quick nighttime rendezvous, a shaky drive to a locked park where the gates were chained and rusty warning signs swayed in the wind. Under dim streetlights and a lopsided moon, they sat in the back of an abandoned parking lot, drinking cheap wine and talking. She laughed a lot, but not in a pleasant way. When she threw back her head, the sound was off-key, almost hoarse, as if her voice came from 2 different throats. She was bold, unafraid of the dark, liked sneaking into locked places where others avoided. For her, crossing the line wasn't rebellion, it was instinct. "I see abandoned places, like they're still breathing," she whispered, her eyes never leaving a dilapidated restroom in the distance. "Can you hear that?" Do you ever feel like we're not the only ones here tonight?" He smiled weakly, but his heart suddenly felt cold. Because he felt the same way. Soon Soph had another idea. "Let's drive to Montauk," she said, her voice light as a breeze but cold, as if she were listening to something in her head. "Go for a walk on the cliffs behind the lighthouse." They arrived as the sun was almost down, a red glow casting a bloody glow over the sea. The wind howled through the crevices of the rocks, whispering to forgotten souls. The lighthouse was closed. Of course. There was no one there. The iron gates were rusty, and the chains were hanging across them like warnings. But the very abandonment made the scene ominously appealing. "We shouldn't go in," the boy said, but only as a formality. He liked the feeling dangerous, uncertain, as if something were lurking at the foot of the cliffs or behind those closed doors. The sky was darkening to an iron gray. Soph just smiled, a smile too calm to be healthy. "It's okay. We're just taking a walk." Their footsteps echoed on the mossy stone path, and each step seemed like a rotting dream. The cliffs screamed in the sea wind. Each sound was like a warning from a faraway place they couldn't name. The boy didn't know what urged him on. Maybe it was Soph's presence. Maybe it was her eyes, deep and bottomless. Something was wrong, but he couldn't leave. He couldn't. He didn't want to. They arrived. The parking lot was as empty as a forgotten graveyard. No other cars, no fresh footprints on the cracked concrete. Ahead of them, the lighthouse stood like a jagged white scar, against the leaden sky, tall, motionless, waiting. No people, no sentry, no lights. Only the cold eye at the top of the tower still revolved, silently scanning the darkness, as if searching for something that had escaped or hadn't yet arrived. They said nothing, only the dry click as they popped another can. The sound echoed farther than usual, as if the air here were too empty, too hungry. The boy raised the can to his lips, but paused. His throat was dry. A chill ran down his spine, not from the sea breeze, but from something invisible, as if the empty lot was listening. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low and slow, unsure whether he was speaking to her or thinking it aloud. She turned to look at him. Her gaze was quiet but deep enough that it was hard to look at her for long. "Relax," she said, almost in a whisper. But there was something inhuman about the whisper. It wasn't exactly a reassurance, it was a command. The sea breeze blew past, carrying the scent of old moss and something else, stronger, more pungent. He glanced up at the tower. The light was still spinning, slow and steady, like the breathing of something asleep, or pretending to be asleep. With only the faint light from their phones, they quietly crept past the lighthouse, which was as dark as an empty eye socket, and began to walk down the precarious path that skirted the cliffs. Beside them, jagged ribs of rock rose from the rotting flesh of the world. Below, the waves crashed, but not in rhythm like the heavy breathing of a giant creature sleeping under the ocean. The wind roared past their ears, but there was something unusual about the long howl, not unnatural sound, like hundreds of voices, broken, whispering at once. A sound that should not exist on this surface of reality. Soph paused. She tilted her head as if listening. Then she turned to him with a smile that blurred in the light. "Have you heard?" she asked. "They're starting to notice us now." Soph stopped abruptly, as if a nerve had been pulled. She turned her head very slowly, her eyes wide but expressionless. "Look behind you," she whispered, so low that the wind had to tilt her ear to hear it. Behind them, on the edge of the rock darker than the night, a figure stood, not stepping out, but as if it had always been there, waiting for them to turn. He wore a long cloak, soaked even though it was not raining. The hood was so deep that only two black hollows could be seen, where human eyes should have glowed. They shone their flashlights on him. He did not blink. He did not move. He did not exist as a living person. The light from the phone flickered, then dimmed, as if the light itself was afraid to shine on him. Not a word, not a step. There was only the sound of the wind changing direction, and his breath began to catch in his throat because something in him was starting to creep into his mind, like a memory he had never lived. Finally he spoke. His voice was hoarse, dragging out each word as if his throat had long since gone moldy. Want some Coke? Not a guard, not an employee, just a stranger emerging from the darkness, as if cut from some false memory. No one laughed. No one felt relieved. On the contrary, the air seemed frozen. The boy slowly shook his head, trying to keep his voice calm. No, thank you. He didn't answer, didn't leave, just stood there, watched them, and then, as if an invisible string was tied to his back, he began to follow. No rush, no hurry, just slow, steady steps, as if he knew exactly where they were going. The flashlight in his hand shook, the light blurring as the wind howled behind him again. But when he turned his head, he was still there, a little closer, as if he didn't need to step, just wanted to. They walked faster. He did too. No running, no speaking, just silently following, like a being without breath, without intention. Every time he turned, he stood there, exactly the same distance away, never closer, never farther. It was as if it wasn't him who was walking. It was the space that was shrinking between them. The wind blew from the sea, carrying a metallic, damp smell like rotting flesh. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs was distorted into a series of beats, like heartbeats. Not theirs. Beneath their feet, the gravel no longer crunched. It sounded like dry bones rubbing against each other. Each step left a deep imprint, not on the ground, but as if on a thin, cold layer of skin stretching beneath. They dared not speak, for the feeling was clear. If they spoke a word, the thing would answer in their own voice. As they reached the edge of the grassy path leading to the parking lot, a voice spoke behind them, dry, as if coming from a throat long dead. "Where are you going?" They stopped. Their hearts were pounding in their chests. No one laughed. No one ran. But the darkness began to move. Two figures emerged from behind the bushes, blurred, misshapen, like human clones, with joints bent in the wrong direction and eyes reflecting nothing. No light, no soul, just black, bottomless pits. They were in no hurry. They didn't need to be in a hurry. This place had long since lost its way out, and as one of them stepped forward, the once familiar grass sank like a swamp, dragging their steps, then up to their ankles, then their knees. The more you struggle, the more you sink. And behind you, the footsteps no longer echo, because the thing that is approaching no longer walks on feet. They didn't run. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they were more afraid than running. Afraid of the sound of their heels echoing like alarm bells in the darkness. Afraid of the sound of pursuit. Afraid of knowing what was really following. But when the car door slammed shut, a deafening slam that sounded like a coffin lid closing, they felt they had made a mistake. Hands, Not just one, not just two, a whole pack. From somewhere out in the darkness, as if born from the night itself, they were there first, pounding on the glass, not with fists, but with claws, long, curved, clinging to every curve of the glass, as if trying to cut through it. Crack, clack, the door was jerked. Not hard, not quickly, but with certainty, as if it had done this many times before. Soph choked. He could only watch, not because of courage, but because he couldn't lift his hand. A face appeared right in the window next to him. Eyes without whites, big and black like two deep holes. A smile appeared on his lips, not because of joy, but because he had found the right person. The flash from the phone that fell at their feet still flickered, and with each flash, it seemed like another person appeared. No one said anything, but in both of their heads at the same time, a sound echoed, like a call, from the bottom of the cliff. He slammed into reverse. The wheels screeched, skidding across the cold gravel. The car shuddered, lurched, and shot back into the night. The people, or whatever they were, didn't chase, didn't scream, didn't panic. They just stood there, silently watching, their hands still pressed to the glass with their claw marks, eyes wide and unblinking. The banging, the screeching of metal, the wind swirling across the cliff, all of it vanished as they passed through the rusted gate. In the car, neither of them spoke. There was only ragged breathing, the thunder of their hearts. Soph turned, her eyes glued to the rear window. The rear headlights now swept over the twisted shadows of the trees, and in the midst of that darkness, the lighthouse still spun. But the light was no longer white. It was red, a smoldering red, like blood in the eyes of someone who has been awake too long. She whispered, barely aware of what she was saying. It's turning around. He tightened his grip on the wheel. Didn't dare ask. Didn't dare confirm. They didn't talk much after that night. Not because they didn't want to, but because there was something silent, creeping through every silence that forbade them to talk. But they still texted, still met, smiled, pretended, tried to live, as if the horror had been a dream. But some nights, when the bedroom was so dark he couldn't see his hands, when the wind blew through the cracks in the door like the breath of something long and silent, he closed his eyes, and there they stood, the ones who never ran, because they didn't need to, just stood and watched. He wasn't dreaming. He knew that, and he knew they'd let him go, just once, not out of pity, because the game wasn't over. A gang? A trap? Something not human? No one knows. No one wants to know. There are questions that, if answered, no one will live to tell. But one thing is clear. He will never return to that lighthouse, not after the sun has set, not when the slow-moving light seems to be searching for something, not when the last shadow he saw is not imprinted on his feet. And if one night you find yourself wanting to take a risk, wanting to feel alive, wanting to step out of your comfort zone, remember this story, and don't step away from the light, because there are things that only come closer when you can't see them. Gregory never forgot Ian's eyes, cold, empty, as if peering through the darkness of an indelible memory. Years ago, Ian told the story, but not in words. He made Gregory promise to only read it, never mention it again, never ask. His voice shook, his hands clenched until they bled, as if telling it would awaken something. And tonight, when the wind began to blow through the old window, when the light in the room flickered without reason, we opened those pages again, and back to that distant lighthouse, where fear had refused to let Ian live another day at sea. Ian in his 50s, his face as dark as ship's wood, his eyes as cold steel. He had spent his life surrounded by capsized wrecks, storm-screaming decks, rusty sea-bleed staircases. The wind did not frighten him. The waves did not back him. He had laughed in storms when others prayed to survive, until the lighthouse called his name, not over the radio, not in words, in something deeper, older, colder than the wind. And since that night, since he had left that island, cold to the core, Ian had never looked back at the sea again. In 2013, Ian was sent to a lonely lighthouse, perched on a desolate rock off the coast of Washington, a lonely ruin that modern maps had all but erased. No dock, no safe access, just a narrow strip of rock, sharp as a fishbone, just enough for a helicopter to lower a cable to drop him. The mission seemed simple. Check the structure, make sure the lighthouse wouldn't collapse. Alone, 4 days in the cold ocean, dropped off Monday morning, picked up Thursday morning. No one, no signal, no way back. No one had said the light was still on, or that it would ever go out. First impression, an uneasy silence, not peace, but the silence of a place that had once been alive and had been forgotten for too long. The air smelled of salt mixed with rotting metal, as if time had melted into oil and rust. The cast-iron spiral staircase was still sturdy, but each step echoed hollowly, like an echo in the hollow chest of someone long dead. The wooden floors were warped, but still bearing the only thing that hadn't betrayed Ian. At least not yet. The lighthouse was 50 feet tall, built in the early 1900s. Inside were empty rooms, dusty filing cabinets, askew doors that looked like they'd been yanked and forgotten to close. At the top was the cold lamp room, its glass frosted as if it had been fogged up from the inside. Ian thought he was just cold from the sea breeze, but the lamp room door had been closed. The first night, the silence was so complete that even the beat of a heartbeat seemed lost. No birds, no waves, only the cold wind like a knife passed through the cracks of the window as if whispering in a language not meant for humans. Ian sat motionless in the darkness and realized something terrible. It wasn't that the world was quiet. It was that the world had stopped, as if someone had pulled the plug on life from this space. A coldness that didn't come from the weather, but from within, as if something was watching, waiting, and it was very, very patient. By the second day, the fog wasn't just thick, it was swallowing the world. Like a thick white wall, it crawled across the stone, slithered through the glass, and buried the island alive in an eerie silence. Ian climbed the spiral staircase, each step echoing from the grave. When he reached the turn in the middle floor, he stopped. A small metal door, a maintenance closet, that had been rusted and stiff yesterday was now ajar. No sound, no wind. But the door still shook. Inside, a rotten wooden box, covered in moss green like the skin of a floating corpse. It didn't lie still. A corner of the lid looked as if someone had pushed it askew. The dust on the lid showed a handprint, long, thin, crooked, not human. Ian took a step back. Down the stairs, under the thick fog, he heard a creaking sound, like an iron hinge being opened, like something had just been released from a box. That night there was no wind, not even a heartbeat of the sea, just a suffocating silence, like a second skin covering everything. Then very faint, like the memory of a nightmare, footsteps on the metal stairs, not down, Up, a clank, clank, echoed from the top of the tower. Slowly, deliberately, as if something that didn't belong there was climbing up from the darkness itself. Ian raised his flashlight. The beam of light shuddered through the air. Nothing. No person. No shape. But the sound continued. Then suddenly silence. Not because it stopped. Because it was. Standing right above him. He felt an invisible weight pressing against the ceiling. Felt something listening. And in that moment between breaths, Ian knew it wasn't new. It had never left. The next morning, Ian turned every cold room inside out, every door, every dark crevice, every rotten corner. No one, no sound, no explanation. But when he climbed the spiral staircase, the box was there, no longer in the closet, right in the middle of the hallway, heavy, covered in wet moss, fingernails scratched across the wooden lid. It had been carried out, and someone or something had placed it there, as a reminder. I'm still here. He stepped outside. The wind blew cold, heavy with the smell of metal and dead moss. On the muddy ground before the tower, there were bare footprints, small, gaunt, muddy, starting from the door and leading to the cliff. Ian followed, each step heavy, then stopped. The last footprints hit the edge of the cliff, no turning back, no landing, just emptiness. Below, the sea roared. Overhead, clouds rolled in like shrouds. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of something unnameable, a tear in reality, a crack for something else to crawl through. And he understood the box did not move on its own, just as the footsteps did not come from any living human. That night was hell. Around 1:30 a.m., Ian was awakened by a thunderous crash. The door at the top of the tower flew open. No wind. No one was there. And yet it had struck so hard that dust fell like ash from the cracked concrete ceiling. Ian sat bolt upright, his heart pounding in his chest like a hammer. Then it came. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, right behind the wall next to him. Not the door, not the stairs, but from within the wall. Knock, 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 like bones tapping against old plaster. Right next to his ear. Not in a hurry, not in a hurry, as if testing whether he was ready. Ian didn't move, didn't dare breathe. The entire tower seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. But he didn't scream, didn't run, just sitting there and waiting. Then a low screech, like fingernails scraping dry cement, trailed across the back surface of the wall upward. The thing was climbing, still inside, and Ian understood then that there was no wind. There was no isolation, just him and something not dead, but not alive, sharing the same rotting concrete structure in the middle of a cold ocean. When the first light broke through the fog, the box was gone. No movement, no trace of dragging, only the gaping cabinet, empty as a crater had swallowed something. Ian had no doubt. He was not alone. Never had been alone. He shook as he turned on the radio, his voice hoarse as if he were choking on water. Medical incident, immediate evacuation. I'm injured. The lie was the only ticket out. Outside, the fog hung thick as the cold flesh of something that surrounded the island. No planes, no boats, only waiting. No sound of people at 7. He locked the door to the lamp room, leaned back against the wall. The flashlight was aimed straight into the hallway. His other hand gripped the crowbar as if it were his own bones. And then, footsteps. clear. On the gravel below, slow, long, steady, he held his breath. It couldn't be the wind. It couldn't be the birds. It couldn't be his imagination, because they were coming up the stairs and stopping right behind the door. He aimed his flashlight at it. No one, but the floor still groaned under the invisible weight. Still, it, standing there, waiting. By dusk the mist had cleared. The faint light from the lifeboat pierced the whiteness like it was from another world. Ian had brought nothing. He didn't lock the door. He didn't look back. Ian never returned. He retired less than a year after the trip. A man who had spent his life in the ocean, he suddenly became as afraid of water as a child is of the dark. When asked what happened, Ian said only one thing: there are places that are not meant for humans to touch. Gregory, Ian's longtime friend, the only person he ever trusted, tried to find out. The coordinates Ian wrote in his diary did not point to any islands on NOAA maps. No names, no records, no satellite images, just a void in the sea, a scar erased from human memory. And that kept Gregory awake, not because of the muddy footprints in the fog or the invisible footsteps on the metal stairs, but because of the only thing left, a grainy video from Ian's helmet camera. The image was unclear. The wind howled like a groan. And for a split second, a figure, tall, thin, standing still under the flashing red light, right where Ian said no one lived. No face, no movement, just standing there, staring straight into the camera. Then the video went completely black. Gregory never played the tape again. In true isolation, reality doesn't bend. It rots. Was it the box, slick with moss and memory? The footsteps overhead when no one had arrived? The hollow knocks from inside the walls, like something buried, waking up? Or was it simply the presence, the heavy watching weight of a place that remembers every trespass and waits? You decide. And if you think you're ready for more nightmares carved from the seams of our world, go on. Subscribe. But be warned. Some stories don't stay in the dark once you've heard them.